Hello. So over the past year, a lot of people have talked about how amazing it would be to get their VR idea just out into an actual product. And I thought I'd take just a quick moment to kind of walk you through what you need to do to get started. Now, this is not a tutorial on how to program. This is expecting that you already have some level of knowledge on that. However, if you don't, this will actually give you enough to where you can go into a program that I have already written and poke around, and I'll show you kind of what you need to change to make some things happen. So that way you can get an idea for what you need to do. If you're an experienced developer, well, this is probably just going to be completely beneath you because, well, you'll probably just know all this to begin with. But what I have in front of me right now is Unity, and I have a game that I made yesterday that is a very, very simple thing. You have a controller in your hand, and the spaceship, or in this case it's a plane, I wanted to get a spaceship, but free assets. Anyway, the ship, it goes in the direction that you're pointing, so it completely rotates to whatever direction you are facing your controller, and if you pull the trigger, then it goes forward at whatever velocity you pull it down. There are obstacles in your way, those little red things that you see right there. If you hit one of those or if you hit a wall, you explode. At the end of it, there is a big green box that you have to fly into, and if you hit the green box, then congratulations, you're a winner. So while this game is not amazing, it is a fully functional game. Okay, you can play it. There is a timer, there is a score. You can actually play this fully functional game. I wouldn't charge more than 25 cents for it, but nonetheless, there are a lot of cool components that I've added into this just for the sake of, kind of exposing you guys through it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through what you need to do just to get your area set up, what tools you need to download. I'm not going to walk you through how to download that. If you don't know how to download programs, this is not for you. Once you get your tools downloaded though, then I will walk you through what I did to make this, and also there will be a link in the description for all the stuff that I have here. So you can download it, you can play it, you can edit it, you can do whatever you want with it. So that's what this video is about. Here we go. All right, so step one, download Unity 3D. Unity3D.com. Go download it whenever you're installing it. It's going to ask you if you want to install Visual Studio. You do. You want to install that as well because we're going to be using both those tools today. Nothing in this entire setup costs any money at all. Everything is free. Unity's free, Visual Studio is free, even all the assets that I'm using are either made myself or they're free. All right, so pause now until you have this installed and until you get to a screen that looks kind of like this, except this won't be there and it's going to ask you to create a new project. Assuming that everything is installed, I'm going to walk you through what you need to do to create just the very basic VR application first before we go into how I did things with my particular implementation. So we're going to make a new project, and this is, let's call this Basic VR. All right, we're going to create this one. We're not going to worry about any of the other assets, and it's going to launch up. Now, there's only one thing that we need to do in order to make Unity function as a full-on thing, and that is we need to install the SteamVR plugin. So up here, we're going to go to the Asset Store. Once it loads, we are going to enter in SteamVR. Hit enter and download this free plugin. So we're going to import it. Once it's done importing, we are going to, moved over here. We are going to click this import button. All this stuff is good. This goes through and it's going to ask us to accept some settings. We want to accept those settings. Once that's done, you are ready to go on to the next step. And it's done. So these are the settings that you need to accept. Just accept them all. It's fine. And besides, if you do that, you made the right choice. All right, so now that this is done, we're going to go back into the scene. There is nothing in here right now. There is a main camera and then there's a directional light, which I'm going to go ahead and explain all this stuff here in just a moment. But just to show you how easy this is right off the bat, if I go in and I browse down into SteamVR, jump into the prefabs, I drag this in here, I delete the initial main camera, and I hit play, and lo and behold, we have a VR game up and running. That is all it takes. That right there. And from here, you're able to start making an application. All right, now really quick walkthrough on the interface here and what you see. So far left tab, you have the hierarchy. This is a list of all of the game objects that are in your game. A game object is just anything from just a ball to something complex like a character. It's whatever is in your game. So if we look at this, we have this camera rig right here. This is your play area. This is the actual SteamVR play space that you have set up. It shows which direction would be facing forward and everything that it needs. So everything from the controllers to the head. And whenever we launch this, it actually go ahead and populates some additional objects for what it needs, like the controller, the model, everything. So if we actually look at it, we can see, oops, too far. We can actually see the controller in here. Every piece of it is just right there. So everything that is in your game is going to be represented here. Now, if you want to put an object in your game, you can either just create it by right-clicking over here. You can create an empty. You can create, in this case, let's create a sphere. We just put that in there, and ta-da! We have a ball that if I move this around, ta-da, it's a ball. So that's how you get objects in there. Also, down here at the bottom, here is where we have your basic folder structure for all the objects that you have, anything from stuff that you've created to materials, to textures, everything that your game needs that you can just, kind of drag in and drop like you saw before. This is your folder structure. Over on the right-hand side, we have the inspector. The inspector is all of the details on one of these game objects. So if I click on body right here, it shows the transform, which is just its position in space. You have position and rotation and scale. It describes where it is, how it's pointed, and how big or small it is. Pretty obvious there. There's a bunch of things that I'm not going to go into just yet on this. I'll kind of touch on them as I go along. But just know that any of these objects that you click on over here, there's the basic raw data on what the object is, and then there's more details on what this object can do or will do or how it senses other objects around it. Like in this case, the SteamVR tracked object allows you to interact with the controller, and it controls sort of like the button presses. And then other things in here we have like colliders and other things that just make the game work. So know that the inspector is where you can tweak all the details. The hierarchy is where you just place the things, and it kind of shows where everything is. And the last thing is the scene game view here. The scene is just a view that you're able to move around in the objects. You can position everything. It's kind of like the raw view of your game, whereas the game view is the actual thing that gets rendered to the player. So this is the camera. So you'll notice that right now we're looking at the ball. If I take my camera rig and I rotate it, oh, I forgot, I put my ball on top of it. So you'll also see that there's a hierarchy here. So that's the word hierarchy. And now I've moved that ball out. Now if I rotate it again, the ball won't move with it. However, if I'm looking at the game view at the same time, I'm rotating the camera. So now you got an idea of what this thing is. I'll go into more details specifically on the scripts later on. Just know that these things, kind of basically what they do. All right, now if you want to follow along from this point, link in the description below for all of the source files for How to VR, which is the basic game that I made yesterday. So we're going to go ahead and launch that up, and I'm going to walk you through what's happening and sort of how I made things work the way that I did. All right, let me give you the guided tour real quick. This is the game. First off, we have just a little pad that you're standing on there. This thing is suspended pretty high above the ground. Now, forgive me, I'm not an artist. I made all these textures to avoid any copyright issues. But this is what I've got for you. This is a platform that's connected to the ceiling. And over there, you have one of the Unity assets that's just a little space, a plane. I meant to go with a spaceship, but I couldn't find anything that I could use reliably without, like stealing. Especially specifically giving it out to you guys. So this is the game. You have the controller, you move it around, and the object in front of you, it behaves in the direction that you're pointing the camera. So I can move this thing around, kind of hard to do this in this view, and the goal is to get it down to the end of the scene. This is impossible without actually looking at it. Nope, not a chance. So the goal is to get it down to the end of this pathway and break it through towards the green wall. Over here, you'll notice let's see if I can angle it correctly. Yeah. So I don't know if you can tell, but you can actually see the platform through this view. This is the view from the front of the ship. So you can actually use this to fly it remotely, kind of like a drone. Maybe I can have better luck this way. No, it's really, really not an easy game, actually, especially from here. Anyway, you get the idea. There are sounds that play whenever you crash, whenever you get through the final marker at the end. People cheer, and at that point, any other object that you break into, it breaks instead of you do, okay? So there's a few different components that are going on here. I've got the camera. That way you can have sort of like a heads-up display or a remote camera. I got this platform here that follows along behind this thing at a set distance. So I'm going to show you how to move objects. We have the rotation of the controller. We have the trigger press. We also have the basic game object that I downloaded from the Unity Asset Store, added it in here. It's a really terrible job, I understand, but it does function. So it'll show you the basics on how to do this. All right, so let's walk through the hierarchy and just sort of describe what the objects are and why they are there. So starting off with the camera rig, this is the exact same thing that we talked about whenever we were importing SteamVR Raw. Nothing else has changed in here except for the addition of the platform. So if we're looking at this, this is the actual thing that you're standing on. This platform here has a number of different components in it. We have the pillar itself, which that is the thing, just kind of shows that it's connected to something. Didn't really make a whole lot of sense. We have the floor object. We have the heads-up display, which I'm going to get into that in a second. And then we have a bunch of these different labels. These labels just show the stats and various things. All of these so far are just kind of dumb things. They take responses from something. There's two exceptions to that. The base camera rig itself, I did add one script. I forgot that I put it here. We have the follow along script. This script just takes the ship object. So if we click on this, we can see that we're referencing that. And I'll explain more about the references in a second. I'm just giving it a very high level here. So this script takes the ship object, which is really just a plane, but remember I wanted to do a spaceship. It takes that and it follows it. That's all it does. This script tells this object, so the actual camera rig itself, make sure that you're always behind the camera by a certain amount. So that's all it's doing. It's just moving itself along. Now this HUD object is a little bit more complicated. This is what's displaying that camera view, this thing right here. And the way it's doing that is there's another camera attached to the ship. So just on top of the ship here, there is a camera where instead of just having the camera play out to the player the way that most do, I have what's called a target texture. This target texture allows me to drag on, which if I click on this, you'll see it down here. Inside textures, there is the heads-up display. What this is doing is it's taking this camera and whatever output it would be, it's putting it onto this, basically an image, and it's just playing a video of what that is. I'm able to use that, and I'm able to attach that to a canvas so that you actually see it rendered out here instead. So this is like really just like a moving picture of whatever's in the camera. Now I'm going to skip past the ship right now just because that has really all the logic, so I'm going to save that one to the end. Moving on to this event system, I have no idea what this is or where it came from. I'm pretty sure it was just created whenever I dropped in the ship. So anyway, ignore that. Moving on to the environment. This is just a dirty way of creating a scene. Typically, you'd probably want to go into something like Blender and create an actual game object. But here, I just have a bunch of different cubes that I've stretched and moved around, and that's all there is to it. Like, there's nothing fancy going on here. These are just a bunch of different cubes that I've flattened and squished. So every piece of the environment is just another iteration of that. The only exception is at the end here, we have a finish line. There is something a little bit special that's going on there, which I'll talk about in a minute. But for the most part, everything here is pretty much just a cube. Now moving on to the obstacles, these are these floating red things. These do have some logic on it. There's a script that allows it to move between two different points. And that's how we have the sort of the oscillating, things that are going through here. That script is controlling their movement, making the game a little bit more difficult and dynamic. So that way you can't just fly the same path every time. You got some obstacles to avoid. All right, last but not least, we have the ship object. This is where all of the real stuff happens. Now, I'm going to give a little brief nod to the things that we have down here. This is something that I just feel a little bit ashamed about. The plane here, I just downloaded from the Unity Asset Store. It is, here, let me just show you what I had to do to get that. It is so simple. So let's say standard assets. I do believe that is the one that it's called. Yep, this one right here. I just clicked import and I downloaded it, and then you get this right here. Oh, I just realized that I'm cutting off some of this stuff. Guys, I'm so sorry. And I'm doing this kind of like on the fly, so just realized that that's been kind of hidden. I apologize. So we have the standard assets down here. We also have the sample screens. Those are both created from it. The standard assets allows you to go and just use some assets to get a game up and running. So inside here we have under the vehicles, here it is, under aircraft, under prefabs, we have the aircraft itself, and I believe I was using, this one. You just drag it in, and it makes an aircraft. Now, by default, this actually does a lot more, like you can actually fly this plane. I didn't want that because it kind of flies itself, so I pretty much just like gutted out everything that actually did anything except for some of the particle effects, and so you'll see a lot of things are just disabled. I just turned most of the things off. It is pretty much just a dumb object that I'm just sitting there and placing, and in fact, if I turn this off and turn on this cube, the game plays the exact same way. I'll show you real quick. There is no difference except for the fact that now it just doesn't look quite as pretty. Oh gosh, now I'm in the middle of it. Yeah, see? There we go. And we can still fly it just the way we did the other normal game. Everything works the exact same. So, you can put whatever you want in there. You can even make it like a fish, or you can make this a Flappy Bird game, whatever you want to do. Everything inside here is pretty much just dumb. It's just It's just the object to make things look pretty. Now, almost all of the game logic is actually controlled in the ship itself. Everything else is pretty much there for, not fluff per se, but it's not a major factor. All of the environments, all the objects in the environments, the obstacles here, they're all important because they have these box colliders, which tell me whenever a item comes in contact with another item, something triggers. So that's important, but that's pretty much it. All the lighting, everything else inside of here, all these things, they are just there to make the game just look a little bit nicer. All right, so let's start with probably the least complicated item first, which is the script that I have to follow the ship along. Now, remember I told you how I linked these ships together. Let me show you how I did that. If we double click an item, it will open up in Visual Studio. Visual Studio is the IDE. It is the development environment that allows you to type code and not have to memorize every little thing, and then you don't have to run the Unity, or you don't have to actually build the scripts in order to actually make anything happen, or to find out if you're going to break anything. This will tell you, like if I just start typing in something here, it knows that something is wrong. So anyway, that's what Visual Studio is. It's just a way of more efficiently writing code. So this script, this is everything that's happening right here to make sure that whenever the ship moves, the platform that you're on kind of follows along behind it at a distance. The way it does that is by setting its position based off of the inputs that I have. So remember I talked about how I could assign a ship object to it. Well, the way you do that is you declare a public transform for that ship. There's a few different ways you can do this, but this right here, this just tells me I want the positions of something. So if I were to put in anything else here, let's say public game object ship, this will work as well. Oops, let's change it to just something different. And if I go in here, in just a moment, you're going to see another variable pop up that is going to allow me to assign something else in here. So if I wanted another ship that I wanted to follow along for some other reason, I could do that here as well. And to assign these objects to it, all you do is you drag it over here, and it will accept the object type that it is. So this first one was a transform. This transform is a very particular thing, and it's talking about the very high-level root entity of an object. So the transform, its actual physical raw rotation or raw position and rotation. The game object is more of the logic side of things, the actual way that you're controlling that object and moving things around, or sort of like the things that are happening to it more so than just where it is. So transform is all we need because we just care about where that ship is. So I'm going to get rid of this and walk you through what's going on with this one line of code. All right, so throughout most of this, I've put comments describing what it is, so I'm not going to go into super deep detail on how these things work. If you need to know what a vector 3 is, for example, you're going to need to look it up. This is not a raw tutorial on how to program, just sort of the entry point so you can kind of know how to mess with this script. So if we're looking at this vector 3, I'm going to break it up into separate lines so you can kind of see the different pieces that are here, and that we can kind of get an idea for what's going on. So vector3.lerp. Lerp is linear interpolation. It's taking two different points and moving it along some point in between those two things. So let's say that we're over here, we have 0. Over here at the very far end, we have 1. 0.5 would be directly in the middle. 0.75 would be 3/4 of the way through. So in this case, we have a position, which is your current position, right? Transform.position. Transform is grabbing your root object, and it's grabbing its position. So it's XYZ coordinates in the world space. So I'm starting from there. So let's say that's 0, where you are. And then the new vector 3 here, I'm creating a new position based off of my existing X position, my existing Y position, and then I'm grabbing the ship's position, and I'm grabbing its Z location. Okay, so I'm keeping my X, so on the X plane, and I'm keeping the Y plane. However, I am grabbing the Z plane of that ship, and I'm using it, and then I'm subtracting 25 from it, so it's always just 25 meters back. And the last parameter here is how far along that axis I want to move, and I always have this at 10%. So it's always, every update frame, it's moving 10% closer and closer to it. So it's kind of a gradual move in and out. Whenever the ship moves very, very quickly suddenly, I catch up a little bit slowly, and whenever it stops, I still move a little bit. So it kind of smooths the motion just a little bit. Now, on that point, the way that it's able to smooth these things is by being called in the update frame. This code wouldn't do anything unless something else called it first. Unity as long as you belong to a mono behavior script, this update call happens every single frame, and in some cases it happens a lot, depending on what your frames per second are. It happens many, many times per second. So lower frames, this thing happens less. But anyway, this right here is telling my ship to consistently move it closer and closer to the ship's final location, but not completely. I'm not just following it exactly. All right, everything else in this camera rig can be ignored. The platform itself, everything else on here is just basic, except for the heads-up display that I've already talked about, which is just displaying that very, very handy little heads-up display, which is showing the point of view of that camera. This is interesting. I've used it a few times. I actually used it in the mixed reality configurator that I did, and there are a number of different uses for something like this in a game, like a security camera, being able to peek around a corner. So that's why I added it in there. It's not actually very useful for this game, but it is nice to know that this thing is possible. All right, I'm going to come back to these in a little bit. Right now, they don't do anything by themselves. There's no special scripts on these. These are just text fields, so it's just words. It doesn't do anything by itself. I take advantage of that later on, though. All right, now moving on to the next most basic concept in here, which is the move between script. This does pretty much the same thing. However, there's a little bit of extra math in here to make it to where that's that nice smooth motion back and forth. So you'll see here we have awake and update. These are all important because they happen at different times of a object's existence. So we also have on enable, just to name a few of the important ones, private void start. So these are these four are the ones that you're probably going to be using the most, of that and on disable, to do various different things. These are important because they happen at various points whenever an object's created, whenever it's turned on, whenever it's turned off, and, oops, keep on making mistakes in my typing, right before the game is actually started, or right before the first update frame, and then finally continuously as the game plays on. So this one was probably where most of the game logic is for actually running the game. These are for you. These are the objects that you're going to be using for actually getting the first pieces of the game object loaded up and created. For example, on awake, as soon as this game object is awakened, I'm going to be setting the speed and the time offset. Now, for most of the variables, I can just assign them here. Like if I wanted this to be static, I could just say the time offset is going to be 1, and that would be all that we needed to do. That would just work. However, in my case, I wanted to use random.range, which for whatever reason, it needs to be done in the awake call. So we are setting the speed and the time offset by a random.range, which is just getting some value in between 0.5 and 2 in this case, so to set the speed. So this is changing just how fast those things move, so that way it's a little bit more random every time you start. And then also this time offset. Both these values are used in the actual script that makes it move. This time offset makes it to where it's every single game, it's not going at the exact same position at the start. Anyway, so just another way of adding a little bit more variance to it. So down here in the actual update call, this is what's, sorry, phone call. I love Game of Thrones. Sorry about that. Where was I? Oscillation. Okay, so this is pretty much doing the same thing. I'm assigning the current position based off of a lerp in between start position and end position. Now, just like you saw with the ship before, inside Unity on the move in between, I have the start position and the end position. Now, there are probably better ways of assigning this. However, I just have it to where it is, I just found a position, like I moved it right about here, and then I copied in that value to one area, and it says, all right, now I want to move it kind of like down in this area, so then I grab that and I set these values to where it'd be similar. So this is just describing X, Y, and Z of two different places, and the script will move in between those two things at that set distance. So, for example, let's say if I want to hide each of these objects except for this one. Now, as of right now, whenever I play this thing is probably just going to be, yeah, it's just going to be moving back and forth. All right, nice smooth motion in between it. Now, let's say I bump this thing down to 100. Now look at that. So we're able to move the z-axis, so how forward or back it is. And let's move that a little bit that way. Oh, a little more. There we go. So now it's not moving, side to side nearly as much. Let's crank it back up that way. There it is. So now you can see how the script's moving. It's just moving it back and forth between those two locations. So again, just to kind of go through the code for that, nothing really different than what we saw before. We have a start position, we have an end position, and then we also have a time value, or a t describing what percentage of the way through that lerp do we want to go. In this case, we're using a sine wave to create that nice oscillation that we're going through it. We're using the time value, which is getting the current time of the frame so that we can move that sine wave forward. We're adding in the time offset just to give it some variance per page load, or every time that you load the game. And it's multiplying it by the speed, and it's just doing the other math to make that happen. So this entire function right here, the entire purpose, is just to go from 0 to 1 over and over again. So 0, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, all the way up, but obviously a lot more granular than that. And so it very smoothly moves between these 2 points. All right, now on to the ship controller. We're gonna open this bad boy up. This is where all of the real game logic is currently contained. You'll notice there's quite a few of these public variables here that are all assigned over here. Just to kind of walk through them real quick, what we have here is, in the first spot, we have the controller, which is this object right here. This is the actual Steam controller itself. I'm using that to grab its rotation and its trigger pull. More into that on just a moment. We also have a explosion prefab, which this is one of the assets that are just downloaded through the standard assets. And this is just an explosion. Well, I guess I can't really play it right now. Yeah, okay, sorry. I'll show you that in a moment. But so what this prefab does is it says in the script, I want to create a new copy of it, and I want to play it, and then I want to delete it. So this is a prefab is just a pre-created, a prefabricated collection of something. So in this case, the prefab has explosion physics, it has other various things inside here, the trails, all the different effects that make an explosion possible. Everything is contained within this one prefab. So I didn't make this. This is more complicated than anything I've ever had to do. So just, if you're not into that, download one of those prefabs and you can just add an explosion. It's so easy. Beyond that, we have the different sound effects. So I had to wire up the explosion sound effect on my own in order to make this play just the way I wanted it to. So looking at the script, I downloaded this from a website. Hold on, there it is. The explosion, both these all came from Freesound. Moving on past these two different sound effects, we have the speed value. And this is just something that I just played with until it felt right. So this is how fast I want it to move. Nothing really to explain there. After that, we have the text values. Now I told you I'll talk about them before. Whenever I created them here, inherently they do nothing, right? They're just text. They just kind of float around. Or I could add a script to here for it to do something. In this case, though, I just wired them into my ship. So over here I have like the time text value. So specifically the one that shows 0 seconds, and then also the death count, this right here, and then also the victory label, which it just turns on once you've won the game. Now you notice one thing, at some point I apparently broke this. As of right now, if I won the game, nothing would happen because I don't have the victory text object assigned here. I don't know when I messed this up, but all I have to do is just drag it over there. Voila, it's fixed. All right. So now that we know where these values came from, now we can move on to the actual code. Now everything else beyond this is assigned within the script itself. All these things are just used in game. So the rigid body, this is the last thing that I want to talk about from like the higher end level. The rigid body and the box collider. These box colliders are just these bounding boxes. So if we want to look at this one for the ship, I'm doing something a little bit dirty, so let's put this aircraft back on, that way you can get an idea for why this is not ideal. This bounding box right here, this is just showing me that this is what happens, like this is the only point where this object, if it hits something, anything happens. Technically, this part right here, if you hit up against the wall, nothing happens. It can just go right through it. Nothing happens whatsoever. If I wanted to change that, I can grab this and I can move it back. There's other various ways that you can have colliders on here. So instead of just having a box collider, there more appropriately would be a mesh collider, or in this case, a set of mesh colliders. That way I could grab like the individual, the wing, the other various components of it, and you could add a collider on each one of those. For simplicity's sake, in this particular tutorial, I'm just adding a box collider and we can move things around. As it is right now, though, whenever I was making it, I just had a box collider around just this one cube. This thing wasn't in the way, so the box collider made perfect sense. All right, so box colliders. If one box collider hits into another box collider, assuming that one of them also has a rigid body, this thing right here, then magic happens. You're able to detect that in the script, and you're able to fire events off on it. So in this case, we do have a rigid body for the ship itself. By default, gravity comes on. However, gravity in this game, it made it way too exceedingly difficult. So I turned that off, and I lowered the drag a little bit so it kind of like feels more like it's in space versus in, you know, the Earth's atmosphere. Kind of a mix. Just I tweaked it until it felt right. So didn't really have to do too much with this. The box collider and the rigid body, plus the box collider on all of the other objects here, it allows me to fire these events that we'll talk about. The only exception to that is the green area right at the very end. This has a special function called the trigger, which I'll talk more about that whenever we actually go through the scripts. All right, so let's walk through the start function first. This is doing nothing more than just setting values to their initial starting locations. So rigid, get component, rigid body. So I am getting the component. So what this is doing is it's just calling itself get component, and it's getting the rigid body. So it's grabbing the object that is this. So I'm taking that and I'm assigning it to a variable because we need that going forward. The starting position, I'm just preserving the starting location. So every time you die currently, you go back to your starting place, which is right over here. And I put it right in front of the camera so that way you just kind of see it whenever it starts. It just kind of hangs out until you do something. So starting position is needed so I can reset it once you've died, because you're going to die. You're going to die a lot. Death count, this can be done one of two ways. I could assign it here, or I could assign it there. I'm not quite sure why I actually assigned it there. I typically don't do that for just variables like this, but anyway, it's an option. So that's pretty much all we need for the start script. All right, now we get into the real meat of this. This right here, this is containing most of the logic that is needed to actually play the game. Prior to this, it's just objects that are existing. This allows you to actually have something that you can interact with. Starting out, we have the update round time. This is just changing that text variable. So the runtime text, this thing that we assigned up here, this is just setting that text value to show the amount of seconds that have passed since the start of a game, so you can have a timer. All right, one thing to note is this only executes if I haven't won the game yet. I have this right here that says if I've already won the game, stop updating it. Bring back up. We have the controller index. This is checking to find out if the controller.index, so this variable that we've assigned up here, we're grabbing its index. So just so you can see what that is, whenever SteamVR, and I really don't like the way they did this, but I kind of understand the choices that they had to make. Whenever we turn one of these controllers on, you'll see that right now they're both gray. As soon as I turn this on and it detects it, it takes this, and now we have an index. If we look at this grayed out one, there is no index. So this is just describing the value that is on the back end, way back end settings for OpenVR, for how it actually works with the Lighthouse system. So the script itself is grabbing that index value, and it's checking to see if the index is none. If the controller hasn't been turned off yet, the script just stops. Nothing can happen until a controller is turned on. Now that we know that a controller is turned on, we're grabbing the Steam controller.device. This device gives us more access than what we could do, what we can get out of the actual controller or the tracked object. Specifically, it allows us to get the access of one of the buttons. So, convoluted way of doing this in some cases, but again, their decisions. There are a lot of different buttons that you have access to, and they all have really horrible names. So the one we saw over there was, for the primary button. There's a lot of different buttons that you can get. So if I wanted to get like the touchpad access, where I guess they call it D-pad. No, actually, I think they just call it access, or the access. I'm not exactly sure, but all of these different things, you have to look them up. I have to look them up every single time. In this case, though, I know that it is K_E button _SteamVR _trigger, that as soon as we get this, we can get the access. Now, this access is a 0 to 1 rate of how far this trigger is pulled down. If it is not pulled down at all, it is 0. If it's pulled down all the way, it is 1. If it's halfway, it's 0.5. So I'm grabbing the trigger pull vector 2. I'm not sure why it's a vector 2 for the trigger, but it is. It's really only a single value, which is a float. The y value of the vector 2 is always 0, so we're just grabbing the x value, and we're pulling this into its own separate value. All right, now that we have the controller, we know a little bit more information about it. In this case, we also want to grab more than just the button. We're also grabbing the orientation. So we are assigning the transform.rotation. And again, transform is the base object, the object that I'm dealing with. So in this case, transform is the ship. I'm grabbing its rotation, and I'm setting it to whatever the rotation of this controller is. Just to give you an idea, if I were to comment out this line of code, and I start this game up, absolutely nothing interesting is going to happen because it's not following this at all. So if I look around, where is it at? Right there? Nothing is, this is so difficult. Nothing's happening. If I pull the trigger, something will happen, but it's just going to fly straight. Thankfully, I've disabled one of the game objects. Will I make it? Will I make it? I'm going to make it! Yeah, I won! That was, yeah, look at that. No deaths, 7.361 seconds. It can't get any faster than that. Like, literally, that's probably the lowest score that you can possibly get. So, but that's not very fun, right? Just flying in a straight line, that's no fun. So we put this back in, and now we can suddenly move the ship around again, or in this case, just the cube. So now, if we take this, we can fly up, we can fly down, all the various ways that we can move that object. Now, before we want to do anything, we want to find out if the user has pulled this at all. So if the user is not pulling this trigger, there's no point in doing anything further. So right here, we check to see if the value of the trigger pull ratio is 0, and if it is, we just return. There's nothing else to do. Now, assuming that they've started to pull this trigger, if the game has not yet been started, meaning so if they've just died or if they haven't moved anything yet, I don't do anything until they actually pull this trigger. I don't actually set the start time until the very first time that this comes through. So first we check to see if it has not been started, and if it has not been started, since they've pulled the trigger at this point, we set it to has started, and we also save the start time. After that, we make it go. So this right here is adding force. So we're grabbing the current ship's forward vector, we're multiplying it by how fast or how much they're pulling this down. So a slight pull won't make it move too fast. Pulling it down all the way will make it move very fast. We're multiplying it by time.delta. This is important to make sure that you're multiplying your values for, actually I probably should have been doing this for the oscillation there too, but I didn't because I was doing it quickly. But it's especially important for this because if you don't do it and you drop frames, then bad things happen with the physics. And then I'm also multiplying the current speed value in there so that way I can play with those values. So this add force function, this is applied to the rigid body itself. This is applying a force. It is saying move in this direction. That's all there is to it. You'll notice the difference between the other scripts that I had where I moved objects. This one I was setting a position, which is not actually making that object have any sort of velocity. It's just saying move here, move here, move here, move here. And yes, it's moving quickly, so it looks like it has some velocity, but really it doesn't, because if I stop calling that, the object just sits there because there's no real velocity behind that object. This rigid body.add force is actually what's creating that motion, that actual movement towards something else in space. So if there was gravity in play, that's how you have like a ball. You could like launch it up in the air and then it would fall down. That's applying velocity. If I just use like set position, as soon as I stopped adding velocity, or as soon as I stopped setting its position, the ball would just fall straight down. All right, moving on to the other pieces of the script. We already talked about the update round time. That is just setting that text value here. Now we have into the actual game conditions. So on collision enter and on trigger enter. These two different methods are important. The on collision enter happens whenever my game object, so this box collider right here, the on collision enter fires whenever this object interacts with another of the box colliders that is in the scene. The on trigger fires whenever you are hitting an object that has the is trigger function happened. So typically whenever you have a rigid body and it interacts with a collider, it just stops. So just to show you that, I'm going to turn off the blow up piece of this, okay? So I'm just going to completely comment out this piece of code, so that way whenever it hits any object, it's just going to hit into it as if it's a brick wall. It won't do anything whatsoever because, well, I'm sorry, it'll hit it, but then it'll just stop moving. So we hit this and bonk. It just runs into it. Now the trigger, on the other hand, the trigger doesn't have that. It'll just go through it. So if I take this same object, actually let's just turn all of the objects on this left wall. We're going to assign them all, and we're going to make them all triggers. Now I can just run into this thing that way, and it will fly right through it. You can't really tell anymore because it's gone, but if I look at it around, it has gone completely out. So that is the difference between a trigger and an actual collider. The collider affects physics, the trigger just triggers. So re-enabling this, looking at the on collision enter, so not the green thing at the end, but any other collision object in the game, it's going to be checking something. It's going to be checking first if the game has already been won. If the game has won, I do something different. We'll talk about that in a second. If the game has not been won yet, then it creates an explosion, which we'll get into that in a second. That's where I'm creating that explosion prefab. It's removing my velocity, so that way whenever I restart, I don't continue moving. And after that, it sets its position back to the starting position. It increments the amount of times that I've died in this game. It adds the death count to the text field that's displayed, and then it makes the game to where I haven't started. So that way, if you hold down the trigger, you collide into you hold down the trigger, you let go, you're still drifting forward, you collide into a wall. All of this starts from the beginning. You've started back over. However, the time doesn't start again until you've pressed that trigger. All right, moving back up slightly to the create explosion, this is where we have that nice effect of whenever you blow up, right? So we're first checking to see if you've assigned an explosion prefab. So if you haven't, the game doesn't break, just nothing happens. You just collide into it and you'd restart back to the beginning. However, since you want something nice and pretty to show, I am creating a new explosion. So I'm instantiating that explosion prefab, you know, that prefab that we assigned up here back in the ship's value here. So we dropped in an explosion here, and I could put in anything. So you saw the explosion here. Let's just do that for fun. And you know what? Because I'm tired of having to move this, I'm just going to go ahead and take this pillar, and I'm just going to turn it off because I'm tired of having to move my my headset back and forth. So yay! Now we can see this. All right, so let's look at this explosion real quick. Oh, I turned it off. All right, now that I've re-enabled the script, let's do this again. Oops. All right, that nice explosion. Every time it just restarts. Now let's have some fun with this. Let's take this ship and let's drop something else. Let's just drop steam in there and see what happens. Not a whole lot. It just creates some steam. What a surprise. How about this one? All right, nice little simpler animation for mobile. All right, so that's the instantiation. Once we have that instantiation, we are changing the scale of it, making it much smaller, because typically these explosions are massive, so I had to scale these down a lot. I'd probably put this with the prefab itself. Normally, you wouldn't actually keep this in a script like this, hard-coded. But anyway, just made it happen. We also have the position, so we're setting the explosion's position to match the ship's position. And then we are setting a destroy of that explosion after 5 seconds. So if I did not turn this on, you'll see that whenever I run this script, it's going to create a lot of explosions. So let me collapse these things down so you can see. So if I were to just put this up here, it keeps creating explosions over and over and over again, and we don't actually want that. So I went through and I am destroying this explosion. So this object that we just created, I'm destroying it 5 seconds later. So you'll notice now in this hierarchy, it doesn't do the same thing anymore. It creates it, and after 5 seconds, it starts cleaning it up. There it is. And lastly, we are playing an audio clip through the audio source. We are playing the explosion sound. Again, we are assigning this explosion sound here. We are playing that explosion sound at the position of your ship so that you have the nice, audio that's coming from multiple locations. All right, and lastly, for this particular method, we have the victory condition. If you've already won the game, and you've collided with something, it's still going to create an explosion. It's going to blow up, but it's going to destroy the object that you've hit. So after you've won the game, you're able to fly around and just destroy that cage that was, torturing you. So it's destroying the object that I'm colliding with, and then it's also playing. This shouldn't be here. So it's also setting the victory text object to active. I actually want to move that down here. Anyway, another bug. Well, not really a bug. It pretty much did the same thing. However, what would have happened then is that it wouldn't have actually displayed it until you crashed into another object. So now I'm just moving it up a little bit more. Onto the on-trigger enter. So again, we talked about the difference between a object that does not have the trigger. So this box collider is just an object that will hit and it will trigger the on collision. This object down here, we have the on trigger. So as soon as you fly through this, only this one, it will cause this method to fire. And just to make sure, I'm checking to see if the game object has a tag for finish line. So it's checking to see if the tag equals finish line. If it does, then now I'm going to be displaying the victory text. I'm going to be set the victory condition to true, so that way the other things that are keying off that, they take into account. And then I'm also playing the cheering victory sound, and that's it. And then you've won the game. Just again, whenever you've won the game, it stops updating the text, so that way you can have like the final time of your game. It stops, you stop dying because you can no longer trigger the not victory condition here. So that's how you win the game. Okay, so I know that there was a lot that was just covered. There's a lot of different concepts that we went over. However, really, this boils down to just a few different key things. We have the ship container, which has the script to allow it to move, to allow it to interact with some other object, and whenever something happens, whenever it hits something, other things trigger. We also have the objects that move up and down. We have the camera that moves along, and it follows along with the ship on that platform. And that's pretty much it. There's not a whole lot that's going on in this. So take your time with it. If you're new to this, then just kind of poke through this and kind of tweak some things. My advice would be just to find something. Like take this this move between script and go and maybe add an additional point. So make it, instead of just going from one point to another point, make it go from point to point to point. So with that, you'd have just like an array of vectors and have it cycle through those. Anyway, I'll leave it up to you to decide how you want to move on with this. But this is how I learned to program. I am a self-taught developer, and I did it all by just taking existing code and just kind of poking at it, changing things, and seeing what happened. Unity makes this so easy, and VR makes it so much fun. If you have never touched a piece of code in your life, this is actually a fairly decent thing to start off with, because I've shown you where you need to touch things to make something happen, and you can just play around with it and make this thing your own. All right, and lastly, to close things out, to make this into a final game, just go into build settings, make sure that your scene that is here is in this drop down and checked. If you don't have it, just click Add Open Scenes and hit the check mark, and then you're ready to go. After that, you just hit Build. It's going to ask you where you want to save it. I want to save it here. It's going to create the actual game file. After that, you can just run it. You can also hit Build and Run there if you want. But that's it. Then you have a game. I am so popular today. All right, guys, that's it. I know this was sort of just kind of like heaped together. Let me know if this was valuable. Did I go too fast? I feel like I kind of went too fast through this. But I didn't want to do just yet another how to program in C# tutorial that a lot of these do. I didn't want to do how to install Unity. This is just sort of like kind of a high level, just enough to let you download this, play with it, and just kind of get your feet dirty with you know, kicking around in this thing. So let me know if you found this useful, and let me know if you want to see more tutorials like this in the future. I can go into more detail on any of these components, or I could, you know, just go back to playing video games and talking about if I like them or not. No matter what, I had fun. Guys, thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, please hit the like button below. If you didn't, hit the downvote button and tell me what I can do to make them better. And if you want to see more, hit subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye-bye. My finger just didn't come out that time. I need to flick it fast.